Viktor Frankl is remembered as a psychiatrist, but his philosophy was forged in the most extreme conditions the human mind can endure. He did not develop his ideas in quiet offices or lecture halls. They were tested in the shadow of death, inside Nazi concentration camps. Stripped of freedom, identity, dignity, and safety, Frankl observed something terrifying and something extraordinary. He saw that when life is reduced to mere survival, the deepest structures of the human mind reveal themselves. What remains when everything is taken? Before the camps, Frankl lived a promising life in Vienna. He studied medicine and psychiatry, specializing in depression and suicide prevention. Even as a young man, he was searching for something deeper than pleasure, success, or happiness. He believed the central human drive was not comfort, not power, but meaning. Then, history intervened. In 1942, Frankl and his family were deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto and later to Auschwitz and other camps. Within hours of arrival, his entire former life vanished. His clothes, his possessions, his manuscripts, his professional identity, his social standing, even his name was replaced with a number. And in that moment, Frankl realized that the question of meaning was no longer theoretical. It had become a matter of survival. Inside the camps, suffering was absolute. Hunger, exhaustion, disease, beatings, cold, fear, loss. But what struck Frankl most was not the physical brutality, it was the psychological collapse. Some prisoners deteriorated rapidly, even when their physical condition was relatively strong. Others, despite severe deprivation, retained a quiet inner strength. Frankl noticed something unsettling. Those who survived were not necessarily the strongest. They were not necessarily the most intelligent. They were the ones who could still find meaning, not optimism, not hope for rescue, not denial. Meaning, a reason to endure, a future task, a loved one to remember, a responsibility yet to be fulfilled. Frankl began to understand that suffering can destroy the body, but meaning preserves the mind. One of Frankl's most profound insights came from observing how prisoners responded to humiliation and brutality. He saw that although the guards controlled almost everything, one freedom could not be taken: the freedom to choose one's response. Men who were beaten, starved, and degraded still retained the ability, however small, to decide how they would interpret their suffering. Some became cruel, some became indifferent, but some became compassionate. They shared their last piece of bread. They comforted others. They whispered encouragement. Frankl realized that this inner freedom, fragile though it was, represented the final frontier of human dignity. Even in the most extreme conditions, a person could still choose to resist hatred, to refuse despair, to act with humanity. This, Frankl believed, was the deepest expression of human freedom. Not freedom from suffering, but freedom within suffering. Frankl trained himself to observe despair without surrendering to it. He noticed his own thoughts. He examined his fears. He interrogated his emotional reactions. He refused to let suffering define him. One mental exercise sustained him. He imagined himself lecturing after the war, describing the psychology of the concentration camps. In his mind, he stood before students, explaining how the human spirit survives extreme adversity. This future projection gave him a task, a purpose, a reason to endure. Meaning, he realized, is not something we invent arbitrarily. It is something we discover, often through responsibility. Responsibility to truth, responsibility to others, responsibility to the future. When suffering becomes unavoidable, meaning becomes survival. Frankl never denied the horror of the camps. He did not romanticize suffering. He did not claim suffering was good, but he observed that suffering, when unavoidable, presents a moral challenge. It asks a question: who will you become in conditions you did not choose? Frankl saw that some prisoners descended into cruelty. Others withdrew into numbness, but some achieved moral greatness. They became living proof that humanity could persist even in hell. These individuals, Frankl believed, demonstrated the ultimate human possibility: to transcend circumstance through meaning. Frankl survived. Most of his family did not. When he returned to Vienna, he faced devastation. His home was gone, his career interrupted, his loved ones dead, yet he did not abandon his ideas. Instead, he wrote. Within 9 days, he completed the manuscript that would become Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most influential psychological books in history. He developed logotherapy, a psychological approach based on the centrality of meaning. Unlike Freud, who emphasized pleasure, or Adler, who emphasized power, Frankl argued that the primary human drive is the search for meaning, not happiness, not success, but purpose. For Frankl, meaning was not positive thinking. It was not optimism. It was not emotional comfort. Meaning, he believed, arises from 3 sources: work, contributing something valuable to the world; love, deeply experiencing another human being; courage, choosing one's attitude toward unavoidable suffering. Meaning does not remove pain. It redeems it. It transforms suffering from chaos into sacrifice. Frankl warned that modern societies, obsessed with pleasure and success, often produce existential emptiness. When people live only for comfort, they lose direction. When success becomes the sole measure of worth, failure becomes unbearable. But when life is anchored in meaning, suffering becomes survivable. This insight, forged in the camps, became increasingly relevant in modern life. Frankl saw that even in peace, humans still struggle with despair, not because they suffer too much, but because they no longer know what they are suffering for. In a world increasingly anxious, fragmented, and overwhelmed, Frankl's message remains urgent. He reminds us that dignity is internal, that freedom is psychological, that meaning is existential, and that even when life strips us of everything, one freedom remains: to choose who we become. Frankl did not promise happiness. He did not promise comfort. He did not promise safety. He promised meaning. And in the darkest place humanity has ever built, he proved that meaning is stronger than suffering. That is why his work still speaks. Because when suffering is unavoidable, meaning becomes survival.